The room is filling up. Just give it another 10 seconds because it's still getting a lot of people coming in, and then we'll get started. All right. Welcome to the Quincy panel on the militarization of the police. My name is Srida Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move US foreign policy away from endless war and towards rigorous diplomacy. Speaking of endless war, many would argue that the militarization of the police in the United States is a manifestation of our endless wars coming home. The use of military equipment against Americans protesting police brutality demonstrates the link between militarization abroad and militarization at home. The war on drugs, the war on terror, the bloated Pentagon budget, pork barrel politics of members of Congress have all led to systemic militarized violence against Americans. If the police are taught to see themselves as soldiers and the neighborhoods they patrol as battle space, then they will end up seeing Americans as the enemy. We have an excellent panel today that will discuss how we got to this point, but also on how we can reverse the militarization of the police moving forward. It will be moderated by none other than Sara DuBois, who is of the bipartisan Pentagon Budget Campaign, which seeks to reduce Pentagon spending and has been on the forefront of these issues for quite some time. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, as always, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and Sarah will get to those throughout the conversation. If you are watching this via Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, feel free to ask your questions in the comment section, and we will try to get to those as well. So without any further ado, please welcome Sara DuBois, who will kick off the conversation. Sarah?
Thanks so much, Trudy, and thank you again for having me here today. I'm really thrilled to be here as part of the Pentagon Budget Campaign. We've been very active, especially this week and in the preceding weeks. Congress is currently debating what our defense policy and budget will look like in the coming year in the wake of a series of overlapping crises, including the COVID-19 health pandemic, the protests against policing in the streets, and an upcoming and ongoing economic recession. I could also not be more thrilled than to be here with my three esteemed panelists. Andrew Bacevich is the president of the Quincy Institute. He is a former Army colonel and an esteemed academic and author. He literally wrote the book on militarism and is out most recently with The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. In addition, I'm here with Bill Hartung, the director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. He is an expert in the defense industry and the arms sales and the cycle that creates within militarization and militarism. And finally, I'm here with Wayne McElrath, a senior investigative advisor to POGO, the Project on Government Oversight. He is a consultant with over 25 years of experience, and similar to Andy and Bill, wrote the premier report when he was the lead investigator with the Government Accountability Office about the 1033 program that transfers surplus military equipment to policing departments, much of which we have seen on the streets in the response to recent protests as well as past ones. Wayne, let me start with you. To set the scene a little bit, can you talk about what are the legitimate reasons to apply military tactics, tools, and training in domestic law enforcement, and where it crosses the line? Has it gotten worse in recent decades? Related, sort of to further key off, Bradley Balco, who is the Bradley Balco, who spoke with NPR's Terry Gross this week, talks about hearing from many service members, especially after Ferguson, that they object to the term police militarization, saying that actually the military has better training, more rules of engagement, and after action reports, which engender accountability. what are the key differences in the missions, mindset, and training of police, and what happens when they have the same equipment? Wayne?
Of course, that's a loaded question. Let's start out with discussing the 1033 program in its infancy, which was actually brought about to help police departments deal with counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism. Over time, that equipment, through mission creep, has slowly begun to bleed into normal everyday policing. There are certain limited aspects in which military goods and training are appropriate for counter narcotics teams, hostage negotiation teams, or hostage rescue teams. They're actually applicable, but in the grand scheme of things, for normal everyday policing, they are inappropriate. But what we've noticed is that over time, there's been a very big influx of or creation of SWAT teams, or these specialized teams across America. And it's really due to the fact that police departments who in prior years probably wouldn't have the resources and funding to be able to do so, now have access to military grade items. The differences in the mindset that occurs between, in my opinion, being a 26-year law enforcement officer and also a Marine, which you're always a Marine, is the fact that our focus is different, and Andy could probably speak to this also. Our focus in law enforcement is to protect the public, to conduct targeted investigations, versus the military, which is to dominate or to engage and destroy the enemy. When that mindset begins to seep into our American policing structure, it gives police officers, some of which don't have any military experience at all, this idea that now they can treat the American population, the communities for which they serve, as combatants or enemy combatants, which is very troubling.
Thank you, Wayne. Andy, to you, what role do you think 19 years of constant war have had on militarization of our police forces? We will be back with Andy in a second. Wayne, just sort of leading up to that and related, what have been the major contributing factors to this police militarization? And how, we'll hear from Andy in a bit about how our foreign policy has become more militarized. But sort of going back the other way, how has the Pentagon contributed, and what role has the war on drugs and the war on terror played?
We've seen this large influx of military-grade equipment that is quote-unquote surplus arrive at the Defense Logistics Agency, some of it being used equipment, some of it being new equipment, and that equipment being turned over to local police departments to use in policing. Although the local police departments, as well as the federal government, have to provide a justification for the utilization of this equipment, there is no real monitoring relative to how it's being used once it is actually turned over to these departments for policing efforts across the country. Relative to the counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism investigations, they're very applicable. They have good use, but given the fact that our biggest threats in America at this particular time don't come from foreign threats as opposed to domestic threats, it makes you wonder why we are throwing this much military-grade equipment at local police departments as opposed to really controlling how we actually distribute it.
Yeah, Sarah, can I add a few points?
Sure.
One thing that's kind of amazing is just the steady flow since the program was started. About $7.4 billion, 8,000 agencies involved. And it's things like mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, MRAPs, that were used heavily in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's grenade launchers, it's sniper rifles, it's assault rifles. So it's a whole range of military gear. And I would say the impact is stronger at the local level, just in the sense that this is almost just a runoff from the Pentagon. I mean, they built 27,000 of these MRAPs for $45 to $50 billion. And then they shifted to a new kind of vehicle. And they were just like, what are we going to do with these things? Costs a lot to destroy them, costs a lot to transport them back from the war zones. So they're looking for places to unload them. And that contributes to this whole process.
Just imagine what the impact of that type of equipment has on the psyche of police officers as well as the community. And it's not just the police that are being impacted, it's the communities that are actually being policed as they become more habituated to seeing this type of equipment on the streets, MRAPs rolling up to peaceful protest or other situations that, to tell the truth, boggles the mind of why the local police department would need that type of equipment for just normal policing. Would any normal citizen will find that troubling.
And these go to communities as small as Moundsville, West Virginia, which has 8,400 people. I think Wayne has cited some even smaller communities that get it. NBC found 29 examples just from social media in the protests since the murder of George Floyd. Major armored vehicles, of which they think there's maybe 1,000 of them out there in police, state and local police and law enforcement agencies. The other thing is, which Wayne mentioned, is SWAT teams using militarized equipment for things like home invasions, which actually the ACLU has said is much more prevalent than using them in the situations where they might be considered more appropriate, like a hostage situation or a threat of a bomb or something. So, but about 3/4 of the ones they looked at were to do things like drug searches and using battering rams to go into houses. This is, one of these raids is what ended up killing Breonna Taylor. So it's not just demonstrations, but it's been seeping into more traditional law enforcement as well.
And I would note too, the Breonna Taylor raid was it sort of shows this blurring of the lines. It was SWAT tactics, but I believe that it was not a SWAT team. And the SWAT, so it's, sort of local police taking on a paramilitary function without the training and without the accountability, which Wayne's report and, ensuing, sort of public comments have showed. And the SWAT teams themselves, as Wayne knows well, were originated out of LA in the wake of the Watts uprisings, and were derived in conjunction with Marines. It was initially called the Special Weapons and Attack Teams, I believe. On that note, and sort of going back to something else that Wayne had said about how, I believe it was Wayne, about, we're using these military tactics. How effective are they? I know, Bill, that again and again, we have seen and you have made arguments. We've seen these both from sort of academic expert class as well as in polling, that it is not appropriate to continue with endless war and militarization to achieve sort of ultimately non-military outcomes, whether it is to lower the sort of persistence of drugs or to sort of improve our economic standing vis-a-vis China, or to combat a global health pandemic or climate change. A recent Data for Progress poll similarly showed that most voters actually see non-military threats and solutions as a greater priority. So, Bill, can you speak a little bit to the disconnect? What role does the arms industry and its lobby play? And as you lay out in the report that you were a leader on, Sustainable Defense Task Force, what is the alternative approach if we're not taking a militarized approach and producing all of this surplus that's being sent to the states? What could we be doing instead, and why is it better?
Well, like Wayne said, big question. But I think, the first connection, which I referenced, is why does the Pentagon have so much weaponry to give away? And it's because we've had historically high budgets, $740 billion being talked about this year, which is more than the next 10 countries in the world combined. many of which are United States allies, larger than the peak of the Vietnam or Korean Wars or the Reagan buildup of the 1980s. And what sustains this? Well, part of it is the military-industrial congressional complex. And these companies have many levers of influence. They give about $25 million a year in campaign contributions per cycle, that is. And they often go to armed services, defense appropriations, the people who make the decisions in Congress about how much money we're going to spend and where that money is going to go. They also spend $125 million a year on lobbying, so about 5 times what they spend on campaign contributions. And in any given year, they could have 700 or more lobbyists, more than there are members of Congress. A lot of them have gone through the revolving door. They've worked at the Pentagon or in Congress on defense issues. They go to industry, they have a leg up in advocating for their companies because of their connections. And it goes both ways. The last 3 secretaries of defense have all had connections to the arms industry. James Mattis was on the board of General Dynamics. Patrick Shanahan was a long-term executive at Boeing. And Mark Esper was a lobbyist, chief government relations officer for Raytheon. And they also do things like they fund think tanks that help legitimate them. They serve on government boards that decide what quote unquote our defense needs are. So they've got a lot of levers of influence, and that's why it's been so hard to reduce those numbers. And without going on at exhaustive length, we did a report, the Sustainable Defense Task Force report, that talked about how you could cut about $1.5 trillion over 10 years by reducing the size of the force. So we're not fighting endless wars. By looking at China and Russia in a more realistic light. Yes, they have military capabilities, but we outspend them dramatically. And some of the threats that they pose are more political, economic than they are military. So we talked about cutting the size of the force, rolling back the nuclear weapons buildup, getting rid of government waste, like the spending on private contractors, which POGO has done a lot of work on, and getting rid of bureaucracies like the new Space Force, which is more likely to militarize space than create a safety in space for our economic and military assets. So all that combined contributes, as well as just a sort of a basic ideology of militarism, to the endless wars, and it's spilled back into how we do things at home, not just through the 1033 program, but I think also just kind of this notion that violence is the way to solve these complicated social, economic, political problems.
And can you just speak to, sort of the distorting effect of that influence and why all of this money at the Pentagon doesn't make us safer? People have pointed out that, $125 million of lobbying buys you $100 billion in contracts, but what is it that is more effectively got through these what would be the better outcome if we pursued a more collaborative approach with China, especially in wake of COVID-19? And how are we contradicting that or undermining that by pursuing this military approach, which appears to be driven, at least in part, by this revolving door and this sort of influence that leads many in Congress to say, yes, let's cut waste, fraud, and abuse, but any suggestion of cutting any waste, fraud, and abuse, including the recent proposals to cut 10% and potentially reinvest it, that Representatives Lee and Pocan and Senator Sanders have suggested with the National Defense Authorization Act, that those sort of are met with silence. So basically, just to sort of pull that together, what would be the more effective? Why is it more effective to do these non-military solutions?
Well, the phrase that is overused but true is when all you have is a hammer, all your problems look like nails. But basically, if you're going to build up a global interventionary force, you're more likely to use it. And we have used it extensively. I mean, by some measures, we're in 7 different wars at one level or other as we speak. We've deployed troops on counterterror missions to 80 different countries. And what have we seen from that? Well, we've seen things like the rise of new terrorist groups like ISIS. We've seen devastation, hundreds of thousands of people killed, countries devastated. The reputation of the United States in the world has diminished, and the US ability to have influence on issues of security has gone down. our own troops have paid a huge price, not just deaths, but also injuries, post-traumatic stress syndrome, traumatic brain injuries. So military first approach has clearly not worked. And now with COVID-19, it's pretty clear there's other things that are more threatening to us. So we should be investing in public health, which is a tiny fraction of what we spend on the military at the moment. We should be investing in dealing with climate change. We should find ways to deal with racial and economic inequalities, which the Sanders bill talks about taking some of that 10% and putting it into some of the more disadvantaged, poorer communities in our country for jobs, education, healthcare, things that will begin to right some of the imbalance in how our resources are distributed. So I think a more preventive approach, a more diplomatic approach. In terms of China, there's many issues that we should cooperate on. Dealing with COVID-19, production of a vaccine once we have one, dealing with climate as the two biggest emitters of greenhouse gases, arms control relationships. And even at the height of the Cold War, there was communications with the Soviet Union. There were significant arms control agreements. Numbers of nuclear weapons came down. In fact, Gorbachev and Reagan almost agreed to eliminate them. So there can be instances where a country has many problems, be it human rights, be it how they are organized in their neighborhood, where there still needs to be communication, there still needs to be cooperation. So kind of a get tough policy on China that doesn't look at those other elements is not going to make us safer.
And also this whole fallacy relative to, well, if we eliminate fraud, waste, and abuse, we'll be able to save so much money is ridiculous. The vast majority of organizations I've worked for within the Inspector General's community, those dollars are soft dollars. They're not hard dollars. They're cost avoidances, funds put to better use. And they sound great on paper, but those aren't tangible dollars that are going back to those communities or programs such as COVID that we can actually capitalize on right now, as opposed to during the next budget cycle. We can allocate less to certain programs and towards others.
Thank you.
Sarah, may I say something?
Yes, please. I was just going to go to you, but you jumped right in.
So I disappeared. It's a beautiful day outside of Boston, sunny, and we had a total power failure. I have no idea why. I have no idea why it came back on. I apologize for missing the first part of the conversation. Let me make a brief comment that probably won't fit in with what we've covered so far, but at least I'll be something other than a passive participant. It does seem to me that when we try to understand our penchant for war as a nation, a penchant that has become particularly strong, I think, since the end of the Cold War, and see if it's linked to our penchant for relying upon a violent approach to policing. That where the two meet, I think, is in the American consciousness. We're not Norway, we're not Sweden, we're not Finland. We, sadly, believe that violence works. We think, wrongly, that violence is an instrument that will enable the United States to bring the world into conformity with our what? Values, wishes, ambitions? And I think domestically, and this probably goes back all the way to settling the Old West, which was a violent undertaking. We think that violence ought to also work in order to keep our streets safe. We think about the absence of success in American wars, particularly, let's just say, since 9/11. Think about the absence of success in dealing with crime in our streets. It becomes a puzzle. I just have to think that somewhere deep in our collective psyche, we cling to this notion that more violence will solve the problem.
And Andy, to add to that, when we talk about our penchant towards war, let's talk about our penchant towards using tools of war against Black and Brown nations and Black and Brown communities, those who are marginalized. America has this penchant towards, when it does use heavy militarized forces, it's against those nations who truly are not capable of being able to engage the United States military in the same fashion.
Yes, You know, Wayne, 2 weeks ago, I wrote a piece that was my attempt to reflect on, as an old white guy, my attempt to reflect on the reaction to the George Floyd murder and other similar atrocities. And I realized that as a white male, middle class, I don't have a problem with police. It never occurs to me that the police are going to come give me a hard time whatsoever. As a middle-class white male, I have to say, when I think about the police, I think about how, man, that is a tough job. I'm glad I'm not doing it. But as I have contemplated and observed recent events, it's really been driven home to me that my attitude really is another example of white privilege. And that has, I don't think it does now, that has impeded my ability to consider with empathy the populations that are routinely targeted by the police. And those are the populations where the targeting presumes that violence is going to enforce conformity. And obviously that not only hasn't worked, but has been terribly, terribly, terribly wrong.
And Andy, juxtaposed to your position, growing up as a black male from an underclass, underprivileged, poor community in St. Louis, Missouri, where Ferguson actually occurred, and rising from a single-parent family of 11 to being a government executive, I've seen the entire spectrum. And the level of policing that I've encountered throughout my life is beyond belief compared to my white agent counterparts. And when actually performing, I was a Homeland Security agent. When working counter narcotics within the San Diego area, the number of times that I had weapons drawn on me by the local police department while performing my official duties, beyond belief. The reason that I'm so vocal relative to these issues is because also, because I am a direct target of a lot of these actions, I'm also raising 2 Black African-American sons that I want them to be able to traverse their communities without these types of impediments, and to not have to invoke some exclusion or exemption, like my father was a federal law enforcement officer, to be able to just enjoy the simple pleasures of life within America.
So let me ask you a question, and forgive me if this is some ground that's already been covered, okay? But
Sure.
Wayne, where do you stand on the broader question of police reform? And I understand, maybe incorrectly, that phrase, or the phrase defund the police, that what that stands for is a conviction that the reallocation of resources from what we call policing to a broadly defined strategy of prevention. I must say, and I know I'm speaking from ignorance here, but I'm a little bit wary about the notion that money diverted to prevention, however defined, will necessarily be more effective than the policing methods that we have relied on, which clearly have failed. So long-winded, but where are you on the larger question of police reform?
We are truly at an inflection point in this whole discussion and debate, where the larger society is beginning to become aware of what Black and brown communities have been enduring for forever. It's not that this is a new occurrence. It's not a new occurrence at all. It's just being filled. And now, instead of hearing from Black and brown communities relative to these abuses, now they're brought into your living rooms and you are able to see them firsthand. and be able to realize that these things are wrong. We harken back to the civil rights movement. There were plenty of leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King prior to his rising up within the Black community, but it was television that truly made that movement at that particular point in time something that the American public had to pay attention to. And right now, due to technology seems to be a way or method that marginalized communities can bring these grievances to the fore. Am I in favor of defunding the police? I think, as you stated, Andy, defunding the police stands for a lot of different things, as opposed to just taking resources away from the police departments and then reallocating them to other areas to see if we can solve the problem. Trying to say that we're going to solve this problem with dollars is another fallacy. We're not going to be able to solve these with dollars, because the minds and hearts of individuals who are actually perpetrating these type of offenses, who we as a community, as a marginalized community, cannot avoid. I can avoid going to the dentist. I can avoid going to the grocery store. I can avoid going to a lot of different areas within our communities, but I cannot avoid the police. I cannot simply walk away. I cannot simply disentangle myself from an interaction because they have the authority granted to them by the state. So,
sorry.
So looking at these particular issues from a militarization standpoint, already having to deal with these types of issues relative to over-policing, now to layer on top of that, the militarization of the police, where instead of not just being a member of a marginalized community, now I'm being looked at as a potential enemy combatant. At least being in the military, Andy, we had LOAC, we had the laws of armed conflict, where there were certain ways that individuals who are combatants had to be treated, which, given the 18,000 police departments that are within the United States, it doesn't appear that there's any overarching principle that seems to guide their interactions with the community at large, which is troubling. So I think relative to this effort, there needs to be standardization. There needs to be better training. There needs to be reins pulled in on these different programs that allow police departments to don themselves with gear and equipment and training that is meant for war. And hopefully that over time will begin to change the mindset.
Thank you, Wade. This has been I really appreciate this exchange between Wayne and Andy. I think that it reflects a lot of just sort of what everyone has been, the conversations that are happening around the country in the national security community. I would note too that in addition to sort of there's been some self-reflecting in every community, including the national security, about the sort of importance of looking through a racial lens. It feels incumbent upon me to point out too that, and to shout out the work that groups like the Movement for Black Lives has been doing, who in 2016 did release a policy platform that included many sort of the and just sort of deep dive, really thoughtful dive on sort of the nature of the problems, on relevant to this panel. Some of the things that were called for then and remain in place today are about divesting from the Pentagon, as with policing, noting the effect, as Wayne mentioned, of America's aggressive foreign policy and militarization there on hurting the African diaspora and just sort of causing violence elsewhere. I'm also calling for an end to the 1033 program, which I want to address. But before I do, I also just want to note that the Poor People's Campaign now is also been doing a lot of great work on this and sort of working on Martin Luther King's intersecting evils, including militarism, racism, and poverty. So there are a lot of groups led by communities of color who have been noting these intersections about America's wars come home for years. And if folks haven't checked it out, they should. I do want to take it to an audience question. Ryan Fletcher asked about what is the most promising vehicle for addressing the problems of the 1033 program and reforming it. Might there be a bipartisan push to include a 1033 reform amendment in the Senate NDAA? Could it gain some momentum? So Wayne, if we go to you, you talked about being looked at as an enemy combatant and sort of the role of tech. You and Andy talked about what the role of funding might be in the policing conversation, but regardless of funding, this 1033 program is providing military tactics and training to local police. And so can you talk just a little bit about, as Ryan asked, what you see as some promising vehicles to claw that back? And then Bill, we'll go to you.
Well, once again, the 1033 program has been around since the 1990s. The likelihood that this program will ever go away are probably slim and none. So let's talk about ways that we can actually curtail the use of this type of equipment. What should happen is that police department, we need greater accountability for police departments who receive this equipment and how it's being utilized on a regular basis, as opposed to, okay, local police departments, give me a justification for the reason that you want it, and here you go. This whole hands-off approach that the federal government has taken relative to this program, once this equipment arrives in the hands of local police departments, should be totally rethought. If the true owners of this material were accountable for how it's being used, then maybe they wouldn't be so quick to put it in the hands of local police departments. And as we can see from a lot of issues relative to policing with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, once they've got this equipment and they're using it on a regular basis, the way that it's being employed relative to protesters is actually not to further enhance the American public's ability to be able to avail themselves of their First Amendment rights. But it appears to me as an observer that the way that the police are clad during protests actually hinder or inhibit the ability of the exercise of those rights. So what is the purpose of the police? Is it to enhance our ability to exercise our rights, or to intimidate those who are actually exercising them? And I think greater accountability for how those are being used would slow their deployment relative to these types of situations and circumstances.
Thank you, Wayne. I want to bring, Bill, if you will address that and also just talk about more broadly the 1033 program and sort of the opportunities for the federal government to limit the risks and problems of militarization.
Yeah, I'm a little more optimistic that the program could be repealed. I mean, Congress created it, Congress can take it apart, especially because our politics are changing rapidly. There's things that you wouldn't have thought possible even a few weeks ago that are starting to happen. So obviously that's not happening this year. There were attempts to do amendments in the House Armed Services Committee markup of the National Defense Authorization Act, which did not make it through. Nydia Velázquez wanted to repeal the program altogether. People like Hank Johnson and Ruben Gallego wanted to kind of reform the program, limit the more egregious offensive weapons, no tracked vehicles, no grenade launchers, no bayonets, some of those sorts of things that obviously have offensive uses, but not to limit defensive things like, things are transferred like, robots that detect explosives, which obviously are not going to be used against demonstrators that could have a role. But I think, there's going to be a fight on the floor, discussions of these bills, probably after the recess, perhaps as late as July 20th. But, Hank Johnson's bill passed in the Justice and Policing Act as part of that. And so it could easily be an NDA amendment that would succeed. Brian Schatz of Hawaii has a bipartisan group, including Lisa Murkowski and Rand Paul, that is pushing to, as I said, for eliminating the sort of offensive elements that are being transferred and limited to what are defined as defensive. Of course, that can be debated as to what is what. But so, I think this debate's going to go on. And of course, we have a Republican Senate, which may be less amenable to some of these proposals, but I think the push from the public is going to be such that things will shift politically. And also, on the issue of the defunding of the police, I agree it's not all about money, but I think money is part of the issue. Some local police departments consume up to 40% of the local budget. At the federal level, the National Priorities Project did a kind of militarized budget that looked at federal spending on police, prisons, the Pentagon, costs of past wars like Veterans Affairs, and it was 64% of the discretionary budget. So that's everything else the government does other than things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So it's, it's housing, it's jobs, it's environment, it's public health. So for all that to be squeezed into that small part of the budget has real implications for our security. But I would agree that the ultimate issue is not just going to be money, it's going to be cultural, it's going to be what are other ways to create public safety. And I think that a lot of groups are talking about that, but that's a debate that has to continue.
I will agree or concede the fact that the ground is actually shifting beneath our feet at this very moment. But at the same time, being in the government for 26 years, I've never seen a government program truly go away. So I'm kind of reticent to think that it'll truly go away. What I'm hoping for is better, quote unquote, policing of this program. And then for the federal government to truly have ownership of what they're putting out there. You're putting this type of equipment in the hands of local police departments. Ultimately, you should be responsible. So, local police departments, tell me how many, whenever you employ this equipment. Being a law enforcement officer, the more paperwork I had to do relative to using anything, over time, I stopped using it because it just wasn't worth it. And that's what I'm hoping here is to slowly grind this to a halt where local police departments and also more community and civic engagement with through civilian police panels, so that you don't have some police chief in the middle of nowhere saying, you know what, I need 5 mine-resistant vehicles, or I need 25 grenade launchers or bayonets or M16s. Now, in our work with GAO, we actually created a fake, totally fictitious law enforcement organization and submitted a request for military-grade items, and we received them. They didn't want to, we provided a justification, but that justification we completely fabricated. So let's look at our local police departments. They make up their justifications. Is there any hard data saying how in the past this equipment would have been useful? Or there has been a spike in terrorist situations or counter narcotics investigations that involve violence. Basically, we just created a justification out of whole cloth, submitted it, and gained access.
Now, Wayne, just out of curiosity, what was that agency called?
Sorry, I still can't reveal the name of the agency.
This is a real behind-the-scenes conversation.
It was interesting when we were sitting in our office saying, okay, if we're going to defraud this program, if we're going to test the controls and defraud this program, what do we call it? And we just developed a name. We developed, and all of the items that we used were commercial off the shelf. We didn't utilize any specialized law enforcement or investigative tools or techniques. Everything we used were things that the average citizen could purchase and utilize, and we were able to gain access to non-controlled items, but that had an appearance of being potential threats. M16s, fake bombs, night vision goggles. Now, if we were looking to actually test the 2 organizations, it would have been the ATF as well as DLA. We would have been able to gain access to M16s, grenade launchers and issues like that. We just chose not to as an organization to do that. But I suspect that if we had requested those items, we would have received them.
Speaking of sort of weapons, there's a question from Jim Lewis about how to address the deeper issue of availability of weapons in American society. With that, I do want to also just bring up a quote that has been sort of haunting me since I read it in CNN a week or 2 ago, which was from the head of a national police union, National Police Chiefs Association, who had recently said that it made sense to provide local law enforcement with military-style equipment in, and this is a quote, in one of the most violent nations in the civilized free world. That quote really stuck with me because it's true, it's simple, but it also suggests this sort of cycle of violence. And so, Andy, can you talk a little bit about sort of how do we address the deeper issue? How do we seek to avoid the, and then we'll go to Wayne, the sort of default to a use of force or use of violence to go more violence? What have you seen in your studies of the US's impulse to do that abroad that might be a principle or a sort of insight that we can consider in this conversation?
Well, I think we have to bring the American people to a clearer understanding of the costs and consequences of our reliance on military force. Here we are, handful of months before a presidential election. Lots to talk about as we move toward Election Day. I am baffled by the absence of any serious talk about the failures of US national security policy. Let's just pick since 9/11 as an arbitrary start point. And the facts are clear. Bill mentioned some of them. Thousands of Americans dead, tens of thousands of other former soldiers that had their lives shattered, 100,000 or more other people, not Americans, who've been killed, something on the order of $6 trillion spent. And the rather simple question, for what? What have we gotten in return? Doesn't get asked. I think it doesn't get asked in part because the failures of US national security policy fall at the feet of both parties. It doesn't get asked because, of course, it's inconvenient for the military itself to have to confront its failures. Failure meaning the gap between what we said we were going to get done and what actually ensued. Question doesn't get asked because the military-industrial complex and its allies in the Congress refuse to let it get asked. So absent a serious accounting that then becomes part of our political discussion, I have to say I'm not very optimistic that this thing is going to get done. Who was it, Bill? Somebody mentioned Martin Luther King's great Riverside Church address in 1967, where he identified what he called the giant triplets. And one of those triplets then, he said, was militarism. Well, it's still militarism. But if we refuse to acknowledge, as a people, as a nation, as political actors, if we refuse to acknowledge the reality of American militarism and its terrible consequences, then how the heck are we ever going to, take the problem on? I think that's kind of where we're stuck. I'm very sorry to say that, but that's the way it looks to me.
No, I agree wholeheartedly with that. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Wayne.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Andy's assessment relative to, the militarization that has gone on within our nation so far. But if you look at it from also perspective, and I said this before, that the ground is literally shifting beneath our feet. Our nation is becoming browner, more integrated, and there's a fear. And if you look at laws like Stand Your Ground, and you look at basically the dissolution of the Castle Doctrine, which allowed individuals to protect their homes. This overutilization of the Second Amendment to be able to carry arms all over the place because there's a fear of Black and brown communities. I think that's what's really driving us towards this, the statement that we need more heavily armed police because you have heavily armed citizens. We really need to begin to take a backpedal from that type of mindset. If you look at where our gun controls in the 1960s or 70s occurred in California, where you had the Black Panthers who were actually, walking around the Capitol with arms. And then Governor Reagan introduced common sense gun legislation to be able to stem that. We need that type of movement again, because I think a lot of this is an outgrowth of a fear of Black and brown communities.
Yeah, Wayne, let me ask you a question before, I know Bill wants to say something, but back at you just for a second. I hear you describing a changing consciousness with regard to domestic matters.
Mm-hmm.
And the changing consciousness is led by people who are Black and brown. And people who are white, in a sense, are catching up, maybe starting to figure things out. But is that changing consciousness actually translating into the realm of foreign policy? Or is it confined, at least at the moment, to the domestic sphere?
Right now, I'd say it's confined to the domestic sphere, but there's a hope. Because as we both agreed a little while ago, is that when we tend to wage war, we have this penchant of waging war against those countries that are not Anglo-Saxon or not white communities, or not white, or perceived white nations. So before you can change anything abroad, I think you have to start at home. If we can adopt that type of mindset here, where we can get back to common sense gun legislation, so if we can repeal things like stand your ground, if we can go back to the castle doctrine as we knew it and we grew up with. Yeah, I'm in my home, I should be able to protect and defend my home. That's common sense, as opposed to what we have now is in the state of Missouri, you don't even need training to drop a gun in your pants and go walking down the street anymore. Basic training. And what was really disheartening to me, I was looking at an article on Facebook, and you can question whether or not it was fake news, but there was a police chief saying that he would deputize citizens to be able to help patrol the streets. Not their job, not their functions. You expose individuals to untrained individuals who we don't know what their mindset or their proclivities are towards. But you have a law enforcement officer who would make that type of statement. I think it was the Second Amendment says something to the effect of that you have a right to the Second Amendment for a well-armed militia. We have a militia. They're called the National Guard. So it just seems like we're pushing too far.
Well,
thank you, Wayne. Sorry, we're getting close to the end. So if you guys want to, I have a final question, and feel free to bring any reactions you have into that. But just, we expect next week, or we know that there's going to be a hearing on the Hill in which the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense will be answering questions about precisely this issue, about the military's or sort of the how military has interacted with this. So I want to get to a little bit of the sort of solutions and what can we do. What do you think we as citizens should be looking for and calling for in that? And what do you think that Congress should be asking? If you can keep your responses to about 30 seconds. Andy, we'll start with you, and then Bill and Wayne.
I defer to Bill.
Okay, Bill, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, Andrew's right. We need a fundamental reckoning with the consequences of militarization at home and abroad. And people have been raising voices. The Poor People's Campaign, Black Lives Matter, have talked about cutting military budgets, cutting imperial overstretch. There's been some conservative voices who said in the light of COVID and other threats, we have to stop pouring money into the Pentagon. But as Andrew pointed out, this is not front and center in the debate. there's not enough leaders in Congress. So I think we need to raise the temperature. I think people need to speak out more strongly and make some of these links. And there's no substitute for, what Eisenhower called an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. And we need to rely on that and encourage that.
Wayne or Andy, any final thoughts before we close out related to especially what we should be demanding and looking for as our civilian and DoD leadership, military leadership answer to Congress next week?
Yeah, I would definitely ask them to take a look at the police departments or what they've seen on the news media relative to police departments and ask, why do they look so much like our military? Then also the hopes that they will give their fair share of that budget to other organizations that could help out with diplomacy, like USAID or the State Department, that have basically been gutted relative to their soft power influence in these types of issues and debates.
Thank you. Andy, unless you want to interject, I'm going to hand it back.
I say yay.
Yay. I want to hand it back to Trita Parsi. I want to thank you all again. I would encourage folks to continue the conversation by following our panelists on Twitter and the Quincy Institute or on whatever your platform is. And the conversation is also ongoing with the hashtag demilitarize the police. I know there were some questions that we didn't get to about sort of the boomerang effect and links with Israel, et cetera. I know that some of our panelists have addressed that and tried them on Twitter. Thank you again, and Trita, back to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to Wayne, to Andrew, and to Bill for a fantastic conversation. Clearly, we only scratched the surface, and this conversation needs to continue and go on for quite some time, because the problems that we're facing are quite challenging and entangled in so many other aspects. So resolving them or discussing them in isolation only gets us so far. But I think this conversation was tremendously helpful in putting a very important light on some of the most important factors. Before I let everyone else go, let me just give a shout out for a panel discussion that we will have next week. On July 16th, we will be co-hosting a panel titled Avoiding Collision on the Korean Peninsula, the Search for an Exit Strategy. It will be done together with the East Asia Foundation in South Korea. Speakers will include Chancellor Jun Young Kim of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, as well as retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis from Defense Priorities. You don't want to miss this, so please go to our website, quincyins.org, and sign up for our mailing list. That way you will be notified of all of our different panel discussions, as well as our other activities and written products. So with that, thank you so much for today, and looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much.